Hi, my name is Michael Gates, and I'm a user experience researcher and alumnus of the University of Michigan School of Information. This year, the School of Information is incorporating a theme to our client-based classes of issues around access to safe drinking water. Today, I'm interviewing Sara Pearson, who is the Source Water Unit Supervisor for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, otherwise known as EGLE. The class I'm conducting this interview for is SI 501 Contextual Inquiry and Consulting Foundations. Our students will be learning about problems and opportunities with drinking water while learning qualitative research skills like interviewing and contextual inquiry. Sara, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Michael, for having me. It's my
Of
pleasure.
course, happy to have you. To start, can you tell us at a high level about drinking water contamination as it relates to your work?
Sure. I oversee the source water unit in EGLE. So source water, it generally equates to the water that you drink, and it comes from rivers, lakes, streams, and groundwater. And so my unit, we oversee source water protection and implementing plans that community water supplies put into place for wellhead protection to ensure that sources of contamination are kept outside of a zone where the groundwater could be impacted and contaminated by hazardous substances or naturally occurring substances that we don't want to have in our drinking water, as well as also I oversee the well construction program, and ensuring that your well is properly constructed is really important to ensuring that contaminants are not introduced into your well, and maintaining that well is really critical. So those are some of the things my team does.
So whenever a plan is implemented to keep contamination out of a particular zone, what does that practically look like?
Looks like it has what it is it's a plan that identifies parties who are engaged in the community, and it's the developers can be part of it, the planning department and the city, the supply, any consultants who help provide them with advice and technical expertise on how contamination can move in the subsurface. If it's a wellhead, they all come together and they develop a management strategy for the planning and zoning, maybe ordinances to keep particular potential sources of hazardous substances out of the area of influence, or if they put certain protections in, if that were to come into the community, they would put certain protections on those plans so that people could look to those and use them as a source. They also include education and outreach and identifying all of the sources of contamination in the area, as well as an emergency plan. So let's say something does happen and hazardous substances are released or they are encountered in the water, what are the next steps? And there's a plan that outlines how that works.
So I'm curious, revolving around problems with water contamination, what are some of the most common problems, and then what are the biggest problems that could occur?
Some of the most common problems are, especially when it comes to a residential well, is that once that well is installed, people have to have it tested and to make sure that it's okay to use that water, but then it's kind of forgotten about. They don't use it. They don't consider it something that needs to be maintained. They can turn the water on in the house and it works. They don't give it any additional thought that the well needs to be maintained and make sure that it's in proper working order. A lot of times people don't even pay attention to the well until the water doesn't turn on in the house anymore. And now what do we do? The problem is that wells can be damaged over time. They can be hit by vehicles, lawnmower, or other things that might happen, and they can be damaged, or groundwater moves. and contaminants are naturally occurring and present in the water. And so it's good to do a maintenance check and to have your water sampled every year would be fantastic, but even every few years, it would be great to have that on people's radar so that they're thinking about their water because they are their own water operator. Whereas a community water supply, if you live in a city or a larger group that's served by a well, those have rigorous testing standards and they have to be tested on a routine basis for specific parameters. And that's not required for a regular homeowner. So the homeowner is responsible for ensuring that their water supply is safe for them. And water moves, like I said, there's natural contaminants in the groundwater thanks to the geology influences. So there's metals like arsenic and lead that are naturally present in some areas. The concentrations are higher and above maximum contaminant levels that are the levels that you do not want in your drinking water. So it's really important to know what your water quality is because groundwater moves and it can bring contamination in over time. And it's tasteless, it's odorless, it's colorless in a lot of situations. We don't know it's there. And we think that water is clear, it's clean, and that's not necessarily the case.
All right. When I hear contamination, like I get in theory that arsenic is very bad for you, but I don't actually know what it does. Can you speak to some of the adverse health effects that happens when you drink contaminated water?
It can cause a whole host of different issues. You know, arsenic can lead to certain problems with some organs. I'm not a toxicologist, so I don't speak to the in depth on what the health hazards are, but there's everything from cancers that can occur from certain contaminants in the water, like we've heard of PFAS as well. We know that that's carcinogen. There's also, arsenic can cause a variety of ill health effects, as well as lead. Lead can cause developmental delays as well as other effects, but I don't really speak to the true toxicological effects of that.
Sure. So you described a litany of problems just then. I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in addressing these problems?
Well, we don't know. That's the biggest thing. Is the big question is that a lot of this goes unknown. If the water's not tested, we have general idea of what water quality is across the state, but we don't have a really good pinpoint of what your water quality is from your well versus water quality from your neighbor's well or somebody in the next county. There's a lot of unknown, and I think that's the biggest issue that we have is, while we have a general sense of it, we don't know what's happening in people's water quality over time. We know with the big community supplies, because that water is tracked so rigorously and they service so many people, that we have a really good idea of what that water quality is. But it's the million records of wells that we have out there. So we figure there's got to be a million users out there of water who are on private wells that don't get that testing. And, it's not until we discover a gas station that's leaking or a dry cleaner or another industry that has caused releases of these additional hazardous substances to the ground that we oftentimes stumble across them. And we not only find those contaminants, but we can find other contaminants as well and issues with wells. And we end up replacing those wells. So that's another thing that my team does is we will replace wells or provide alternate water to people whose wells are contaminated, especially by industry or commercial applications like dry cleaners and things of that nature, gas stations.
Do we know how many wells are in the state?
I have 1.2 2.5-ish million records for wells. So we have a lot of wells. Michigan ranks up there as being one of the top states in the nation with drinking water wells. Unfortunately, we do have records of them, but we don't have the water quality.
Okay. But based on other surrounding data, we can generally assume that they're of safe drinking quality.
For the most part, yes.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
So involving the work that you do, I'm curious if you could name any information or technology opportunities in addressing the challenges you face.
Well, one thing that I've been working on with a team is getting this data together. We have data that's in many different forms. You know, we're transitioning from a paper society to a digital society. So we have a lot of our records that are in paper format, and getting that into a digital usable data format that we can analyze is a big uphill battle, as well as having a system that we can house that information. So we have started a process of looking at a comprehensive groundwater system for across the state that will have the geological information, it will have the aquifer information, it'll have the water quality information. And our goal is then to be able to know what the capacity of our aquifers are, because water is not distributed evenly across the state either. You know, we look at Michigan and we're surrounded by the Great Lakes, so one would think that there's water everywhere. And the most interesting thing is that the geology is so unique in that there are areas where you're looking at Lake Michigan, but the water below you is very little, just because we don't have recharge in those areas. So it's limited water.
That's surprising to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other opportunities around communications or service blueprinting of any kind?
The education is a huge component, and the outreach is so needed across our state, and the messaging that our behaviors, what we do every day, can impact the quality of our water, and you know, where we're disposing of products and what we're putting into our septic systems, what we are, you know, just doing as a daily routine, you know, discharging things to surface water. It's all related, and it's all connected, and it's all one water, and it cycles through our bodies, and it goes out into our septic fields. Well, we're also putting a lot of other stuff in our septic fields and products that we use that, you know, are a lot of conveniences, but our septic systems don't treat for that, because they're built to treat for what we consume and what we discharge from our bodies, not necessarily the dishwashing products or the detergents that we use. And it would be very good to have even more education on those and the products that we use.
How negatively do those detergents and cleaning products affect our drinking water?
Overall, you know, you typically just use relatively small quantities, but over time, and if you're in a very congested area where there's a lot of wells and a lot of people and a lot of activity, it can adversely affect the water. And so, you know, depending on how remote and how far away your neighbors are, the groundwater can take some of those contaminants. But if it's over time and it keeps building up, they can build up as well.
So typically an issue for like major urban areas.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of them have municipal water, and so that they're supplied by a single source. Just because of all of those activities, it just makes more sense to make sure everybody has safe water that way.
I'm curious, if you had a magic wand and could change one thing around water contamination as it relates to your work, what would it be?
I would make it easier to clean up.
That'd be great.
Because millions and millions of dollars to clean up, and I would have access to the information to know where the contamination is and be able to prioritize what steps we need to take to focus dollars on those versus other spots that are less threatened or impacted.
I'm curious if you were imagining a future where the technology is there to do, stuff that we can't even conceive of now. Like, could you imagine an infrastructure of the future that's able to tell where the contamination is coming from, or any other kind of futuristic ideas that might be helpful?
That would be completely incredible. If we could speed up the timing to know where contamination is coming from and be able to predict where it's going to go and who is in its way without having to spend what we have historically taken decades to determine. If we can do that very quickly and be able to provide people with treated water that is good for them versus having to go through iterations of investigation, which is what we have historically done to determine how far something is moving along, that would be fantastic. And some of my groundwater data management system might be able to do that, as far as speed up that process of the investigation. But if we had that magic system that would just say, this is where the contamination is based on what we're seeing, where we're finding it. And if everybody had systems that and tested their water quality, we would be able to identify these so much sooner.
I wanted to jump back to a previous question. I know the wells are all across the state. There's so many of them. I'm curious to check the quality. Do we have to go in person to check it out, or can any work be done remotely?
Well, it can be done by the homeowner. They can do that in person, and they can request the test kit, and they can grab the sample, and they can send it off to the lab. So it would have to be done that way. But as far as any other kind of remote monitoring, not really, not for what we're looking for.
For the kit, how commonly is that done?
It's usually done if there is a concern raised or someone is curious about it, but typically the most common is the well is installed. They test the water to ensure that it passes, and then they don't do it again. Now, we just opened up an opportunity with $5 million in funding, which is going to cover about 20,000 samples from 20,000 residents. So we're just scratching the surface of those million with that funding. So it's going to take a lot more to be able to have everybody be able to do that.
Wow. So our students are going to be spending a semester investigating a specific problem around drinking water, and many of which will be doing water contamination. Knowing that, is there anything about this topic that I should have asked you that I didn't?
I think one of the big things is that the contaminants that we know have been out there for a long time, and now we've come into an age where contaminants, emerging contaminants, are starting to become more prevalent. We're identifying more contaminants like PFAS. That has come on the scene in the past 5 years or so as becoming, highly visible. We weren't aware of these chemicals. We weren't aware of how ubiquitous the chemicals are, and in all of the products that we use that they are in. And now we're finding that it's in people's water, and it has caused ill health effects. It has caused cancers, and it is a substance that we do not want to be drinking or consuming in our food products. And we're finding that it goes through the food chain. So those are things that are coming on the horizon, as well as other products that we've been using that we aren't talking about today, but they are contaminants of emerging concern, and they can be, biologicals. We learned quite a bit from COVID, but additionally pharmaceuticals, how we use pharmaceuticals, and discharging those, even that we use for our own health. We can, discharge the waste from some of those that our bodies didn't use and can get out into the water. Or if we dispose of pills down into our septic system, that's not a really good idea for doing that. So it's the pharmaceuticals, or microplastics are another thing that are showing up in our water. That these challenges are going to continue, and I think that that's one of the most important things, and that we need to start asking questions of ourselves about the products that we're using, and as consumers and people who become educated about their water and what's in their water, start making some good decisions, some smart decisions. And I think it will help, but we're going to continue to see these coming, I'm sure.
Curious, the emerging contaminants, are they all things that are just kind of industrial byproducts?
Not necessarily. The more we learn about reactions, chemical reactions for things that have occurred in the environment, we may give us more information. The better our tools are, the better that we have created tools that help us further define geology and the subsurface and answer more questions. We have found that there's more things that we don't know. So, it may not just be industrial byproducts or commercial products that we use. We may find that there are things occurring within the earth that we didn't know about, and there's more opportunity to learn as we develop more sophisticated tools, more sophisticated screening, and much better equipment.
Well, thank you for making time to talk to us today. It's very much appreciated.
Sure. Absolutely.
All right, Sarah, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.